today at the Tabernacle, and as you did the homework and looked back through things, what struck you? We've talked a lot about biblical theology. We've talked a lot about putting the pieces together. What struck you as you looked at the Tabernacle, looked at these issues again? What perhaps did you see now that you had not seen before when we had gone through it?
Specific nature in which God outlined everything exactly the way he wanted it, and for the Israelites looking at his instructions, it's why do you care whether the thread that holds the plaque made of gold is blue or orange? But everything he has, even if we can't even comprehend what it was, it's there's a reason behind that.
Yeah, it's crazy when you think about that. The 2 chapters deal with the creation of the world, the whole world. Part of one chapter, half of another, verses. And then you get into the tabernacle, and it's every post is described, every thread, colors. And I think you're exactly right. It all means something, but do you feel a little bit baffled by that? There's just so much detail and it means something, but why? Why is it there? What does it mean? What strikes you about any of that? I mean, the people who built it, it says the Spirit of God empowered them, just like to prophesy, whatever. They were empowered to build that tabernacle, given skill to build the tabernacle. What's most confusing about the tabernacle to you?
God promises the Israelites that he will meet with them between the cherubs on the mercy seat, which is really interesting to me that the one place where he's going to meet with them is where the people can't go.
Yeah, that's very strange. And got a great picture. It's right here. God says, I'll meet you between the cherubs. And we don't know what it looked like. I don't know if I've shown you this before. The weird thing is, we have a picture. We almost have a picture of what it looks like. Let's see if I can find it. Strange. Well, when the temple was sacked in 70 A.D., they did a triumph, the Ark of Titus, and they put on the Ark of Titus exactly what the candlestand looked like because it was pure gold, 75 pounds. They didn't think the Ark of the Covenant was important because it was made of acacia wood, covered over with gold. But on that ark is a box, is the corner of a box. You can just see it. And a lot of people think that actually was the Ark of the Covenant. But it's just out of frame. It's like you can see the corner of it. And I've been in Rome and stood there at the Ark of Titus, and you see it, and it's just frustrating as all get out to think that you're within feet of somebody who actually saw it and was trying to, but didn't think it was important, so it's kind of off to the side. But God says he'll meet between the cherubs, and we don't know what it looked like. This is kind of Ezekiel's picture of cherubs, four-faced. But what we do know is that on the Day of Atonement there was blood, and I think, Timothy, this is your point, is it not? That, I mean, that's the last place in the world you want to be, is between cherubs. And yet God keeps saying, I'll meet you between the cherubs, but the cherubs have been ordered to hack anybody to death who's a sinner. So, you know, do you ever have friends like who are really powerful people, and you get around them and you think, you know, wow, this is really nice. This person isn't going crazy. I've got some friends like that, and you know, you look at people like that. I think if I looked at this, I would think, you know, maybe this isn't the best place in the world to be. And then the idea that God is going to meet between the cherubs, particularly, I mean, this is like a drop of blood. If you imagine there were a lot of blood, if you stood there, it would look like someone had been hacked to death. And, you know, the whole idea, am I next, you know, because I'm a sinner. That's interesting to think about. What else? What else do you find interesting and confusing about the tabernacle? There's actually a New Testament parallel. I think the first time I saw it, it was really encouraging. Help if I could type in English, not Greek. When you come to Revelation, it starts talking about these 4 living creatures, and they're standing there. What's interesting is that these living creatures are described very much in similar terms to cherubs. And so you realize that Revelation is describing us standing before God in the midst of cherubs, and yet the cherubs aren't killing us. So it's interesting, and perhaps this is some of the reason the detail is like front-loading detail, and then you don't have it work out until you get to the end and see how all the threads of the story come together. What else do you find interesting about the tabernacle? We've talked before, but I want to make the point again about this little thing. What is this little thing called? It's the Ark of the Covenant, and what's the Hebrew word for it? It's coffin. Now, I think I have a picture. That kind of gives you an idea how big it was. It's a little bitty thing. I mean, that looks like a child's coffin, does it not? And if you have blood, this thing, one of the sources calls a crown. The top's made out of pure gold. The rest of it, the rest of the box, is made out of acacia wood. We talked about how that's thorn wood covered over with gold. So it seems strange. The amount of detail about this thing, and why is it called a coffin? What's inside the coffin? There are 3 things. The 10 Commandments. Bread from heaven. Tell me why those 3 things are important. Why would God... That seems a strange thing to put inside a coffin to me.
because we can never live up to the law, we're dead in God's eyes. But with the budding staff, it shows that God can bring dead things
Back to life. Yeah.
And then the manna shows that He provides even when we're in desperate situations.
Bread from heaven. What else do you find interesting about that? How might any of it relate to Jesus? Jesus is called just bread of life coming down out of heaven. How else?
He also is the fulfillment of the law.
He's the perfect fulfillment of the law. He's the one who obeyed the law. And he's the perfect priest. And what was it that came back to life? It was Aaron's dead tribe stick, whatever you want to call that thing, his mateh. And it not only came back to life, but it bore fruit, almond blossoms, in the whole Eden language. So you've got Jesus is the one who's restoring life. What else do you find interesting about the tabernacle? I mean, some of the things that I find just very interesting is when you read what was it, 4 or 5 chapters I had you read for homework, did you get lost in the details of it? Like maybe a chapter in, it just like your eyes glaze over a little bit. I think that happens to everyone. And with a lot of this, you don't get what it is until you actually get a piece of paper and write it down. For instance, what are all these things based on what your reading was? What are all of those? Yeah, they're pillars. And did you find it striking that they give you exactly the measurement of the pillars? It wasn't until I actually tried to draw it out, and there are 5 pillars here, but 4 pillars here. You ever take time to count how many there would be? Turns out if you count them all, there's 69. And then God describes himself as a pillar of fire. Now, is there anything interesting about that to you? What's interesting, Daniel?
There are 70 nations.
There's 70 nations. That's kind of, it's like, what is that? You don't get that unless you actually get a piece of paper out and measure it and, do the spacing. Another one that's like that, to me, if you've ever gone to Ezekiel and you read his measurement of the heavenly temple, you get something like that. It's like, he's describing it here, all these different places. But it's strange that you don't quite realize it's a cross until you map it out. So this big heavenly temple that's being built is this cross-like structure. When you start asking, what all this means, the New Testament's going to tell us that it's all connected to Jesus. And when you go through it, the biggest thing that you see is this bronze altar. Here it's put on the ground. A lot of people, when they present this, will actually put it on a raised platform. If it's on a raised platform, it's going to be 7.5 feet tall. It's going to be 7.5 feet wide. And if you walked in here, what's weird about it if it's 7.5 feet tall? So you're just walking in the front door of the tabernacle, and you're seeing something that's 7.5 feet tall. What strikes you about that? There's something that just strikes me, almost shakes me about it. It's the only thing you would be able to see. If you walked in the front door, all you could see would be this bronze altar. And we're told that that altar, I mean, you can see this is if it's 4.5 feet tall, but if it's on a mound, it's going to be, I mean, you think of how graphic that would look. This is all the accidental sins for 3 million people. 3 million people. And you think the tabernacle, the little building itself, is, you could fit it inside this room if it were higher. 3 million people using that. I mean, there's going to be blood everywhere. And you can't go. You know, women are excluded, and Gentiles are excluded. If you're a man, you can go to here. But what you're going to see is blood everywhere. That would scare me to death. And then you realize, well, maybe it should scare me to death. Maybe that's the point. If you're told to put blood on these horns, well, what would that look like? It would look like something had been gored to death. And imagine walking into a church and the first thing you see is this roaring fire that just consumes these whole offerings. Blood everywhere on the ground, blood on the horns, and you're a sinner and you're wanting peace with God, and what you see is like this wrath against sin. That would be terrifying. And then we've talked before, but you almost can't think of this too much. This is what you owed if you committed an accidental sin. You know, forgetting to do one thing or another, you would have that, but if you committed an on-purpose sin, there's no sacrifice for you. And the whole idea of Jesus being our high priest and bringing us in, but offering himself on the hellish altar of God's wrath against sin, you start to see that God was wanting to give us a picture so that we could see. We don't know what this looked like exactly. It had horns, it was carried, made out of acacia wood, covered over with bronze. There's something about a basket, evidently, that keeps the stuff off the fire. And you can imagine if you were putting all kind of meat on there, what would happen is the fat of that meat would fuel the fire, and so it would become intensely hot. This is the one that's built in the Judean desert, and they made a trough for the blood. You can imagine if you had 3 million people doing these sacrifices, that you would need a trough long way to take care of all that. I think this is the ESV Study Bible. They put the basket upside down to carry it. That very well may be. I didn't think that's what the Hebrew was saying, but it could be. We're told that the fire must never go out. And the only thing else in Scripture I know of that the fire never goes out is hell. So I wonder if this thing isn't a picture of God's wrath against sin. And the first thing people experience is that God is angry. And I don't know, did any of you grow up in a tradition where preachers tried to scare you into heaven? Can I get a witness? I grew up in a tradition like that, and I guess I was a very bad little boy because my mom would take me to revivals, and I remember some of those. I would be so terrified of going to hell. And we've gotten away from that a little nowadays, that don't preach like that. But the truth is, the Bible's full of that stuff, isn't it? And the idea of God saying, look, I created you. I own every molecule of your body. I know everything that you do. I have put my law in your heart. You know what I want. And yet we are finite creatures and we choose to rebel against God. Maybe we should be terrified. Maybe we should, walk into the tabernacle and realize that God really is just and he really is angry with sin. And maybe that's the first steps toward our relationship, to realize that we've offended God. I love that the closer you get to God, the more precious the metals become. The farther away you are, but the closer you get, more expensive. The detail, again, all of these, you don't realize until you try to build it that it's telling you to double up these ones in the back, but you do that and you realize that God's given us a fairly clear pattern for what this is like. We don't know what this laver is. We know that priests wash their hands and feet. We don't know what the table looked like other than there was a crown, wine, and bread made out of acacia wood, the top pure gold. We do know what this looked like, and what it looked like was this. This is what the Ark of Triumph looks like, and made out of 75 pounds of pure gold. All this is Temple Institute, so if the Jewish people ever rebuild a temple, this would be what they use. Again, you can see the lampstand. You get to the center, you see the Holy of Holies with the cherubs. They put the altar of incense to the side. I think it's probably in the middle because it's mimicking the outer court where you have the altar and then you enter. This is an acacia tree. It has touch me not thorns all over it. If you prick yourself, you can get gangrene. The temple is made out of that wood but covered over with gold. You never see any of it because it's all gold. Oh, here's the Ark of Titus. So that's somebody who actually saw it. Tore the thing down in 70 AD. They took it to Rome. They brought it into Rome. That's what they carried in. It was 75 pounds of pure gold, so they thought it was most important. But right here, you can just barely see it as the outline of a box, and the men are carrying it, and a lot of people think that's the edge of the Ark of the Covenant, but we can only see that little bit of it. When we come to the temple model, the temple is just a developed tabernacle, so it has the same structure. This is the outer wall. We've got a plaque that we've found, archaeological, says if you cross this wall, you'll be put to death if you're not a Jewish person. That's probably what Paul means when he talks about the middle wall of separation is taking down. If you are a woman, you could go in this court. Jesus was in this court when they were throwing the money in the treasury. That's where he did it. If you're a Jewish man, you can go into this court. If you're a priest, you could go into this room. If you're in the high priest, you can go into the Holy of Holies. We've seen before that the cherubs are there, so this is meant to mimic Eden, right? Going back to Eden. The cherubs are on the veil. This is something we didn't get to talk about last time, but we should talk about it now. And it's Ezekiel 28. And it's not clear who's being spoken of, but the text is speaking to a wicked figure. And he said, "You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, crafted in gold. You were an anointed guardian cherub." So Ezekiel is writing like 572, something like that. He dates his writing. The problem is he's talking about a person who's been in Eden. And so some people think it's like man and saying you were in Eden and you, but some people think it's Satan. I placed you, you were in the holy mountain in the midst of the stones of fire you walked. That doesn't sound like Adam. That sounds like some supernatural creature. And if that's true, if Satan is being called a cherub, that's very interesting that the one who can exclude you from Eden is Satan, given the power to exclude sinners. And then you realize the whole meta-narrative, when Jesus died, the veil was ripped in two, that the way to Eden was opened. What's interesting about that is this is the temple in Jesus' day. So this is the court of the women. That's where the money was. If you go in here, this is Jewish men, and then the temple. What's interesting about that to me is if you can imagine yourself just right over here, down a little ways. This wall wasn't built until just before Jerusalem was destroyed. But if you can imagine yourself right over here, down a little bit, that's where Jesus would have been crucified. So he crucified within almost a baseball throw from the front of the temple. Solomon's temple, same detail. If we read that, some are higher than others. The rooms are actually described how they're cantilevered, so they don't have things holding them. Ezekiel's temple, built like a cross. And then the New Testament says that we are God's temple. We are the temple of the living God. I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And then you think, well, maybe that's why it's made out of thorn wood but covered over with gold. Maybe we're being redeemed and covered over with gold and made into the image. The details are just incredibly detailed. One is that there are these two curtains that are joined with these gold rings. I never really understood what that was about until I tried to build it. And once you try to build it, you realize it's telling you which way the curtains go. And it may be that the seam was right over where the Holy of Holies is. The colors are a bruise color, a purplish color, and a blood color. I wonder why that's picked out. Why you have a pure white thing and then these colors, and then you think, oh, if it's somehow connected with Jesus and Jesus' suffering. This is a passage that talks about the fire not being quenched. The whole idea of meeting God there, and Jesus has allowed us to meet God. This is the tabernacle that's actually in Israel. We actually drove there on a trip, but we didn't go inside. It wasn't open that day, but that's probably what it looks like, probably what the sides look like. And it's interesting that it grows over time. This is how big it would have been. This is Solomon's temple. This is an American football field. So Solomon's temple is big. Herod's temple, much bigger than a football field. And then when you get to Ezekiel's temple, I mean, that's like 2 or 3 football fields. And then Ezekiel's temple is huge. I mean, that temple was never built, some kind of eschatological temple. You can see the cross nature of Ezekiel's temple there. This is the model that they take you to. When I saw it the first time, it was outside of the King David Hotel. They've moved it now to be near the shrine of the book, but this is a scale model of what Jerusalem looked like in 70 AD, shortly before it was destroyed. Again, here is where the temple was, and here is where Jesus died. These walls are later, added later, so very close. All right. Well, I'll see you on Friday.